Magick.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on magick.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You are really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magick.me, magick.me.
All right, Dr. Bynum, it's a privilege to welcome you to the podcast. Thank you for being on. Would you like to maybe just tell us a little bit about who you are and what your work is focused on, please?
Yes. Well, first of all, Jason, thank you very much for inviting me on your program. I'm very excited to be here, to be able to talk to people, to reach out to lots of folks on hopefully some issues that are very germane to them. Certainly, I feel that they are. As far as my own background, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, regular graduate school, Ph.D., then the licensing, et cetera, after that. And I've worked at several different universities, but most prominently the University of Massachusetts, where I was there for several decades, primarily as a clinical psychologist in the health services. And I was a regular bread and butter therapist. I saw individuals and families. My areas of specialization were psychosomatic medicine, dream work, and family therapy, in addition to those other two. So that's what I did on a day-to-day basis. I was not primarily an academic. I was a hands-on clinician. And so I worked with people who were like in the thick of it. And it was very rewarding, sometimes very demanding, very stressful occasionally. But that's what I enjoyed doing. And out of that foment of, the real life, the real stuff, came my interest, which I was able to funnel into a number of different books. The two that we're going to talk about today primarily are our African unconscious and perhaps to some extent dark light consciousness. So again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk, and I hope that we can throw some light on some dark areas.
I really want to talk about that process of where you went from clinical work to getting interested in esotericism. That's a big leap. But before we do that, maybe just talk about I'll tell you what, why don't I just start this off? I just want to read the first few lines of our African Unconscious, because I think that the book is beautiful, and I just wanted to, this is so powerful. I just thought it'd be a good way to kick it off.
Sure. So you do it.
So you say in your introduction, there is a new wind flowing across the landscape of Africa and across the inner landscape of African diasporic peoples. It is a wind that sweeps before it the idols of a civilization shaken to its roots by a technology that pollutes the seas while extending some lives, is adrift amid the appalling moral contradictions of extravagant wealth and extreme poverty, and watches helplessly over the decay of cities, the rising grip of multinational corporations, and the final painful death spasm of outmoded political and economic paradigms. Communism as a force in the world is dead. Its cousin, the welfare state, is a sick child. In the United States, the greatest market of this empire, the vast majority of people feel its citadel is in moral and spiritual decline, its vision of itself sinking in sensationalism and ashes. You need not be a devotee of Nostradamus or the myths and prophecies of ancient peoples to know that our current world order is in a severe crisis, and that monumental changes are afoot that will alter our sense of self, origin, and identity. Whether they come peacefully or in some prophesied war or a series of global economic depressions, such cataclysms tend to stimulate a search for our deeper origins in order to have a fuller union. That deeper union, body, genes, and psychic perfusion, is the African lineage in everybody. With a new view of mind, this has scientific and spiritual implications. The eye of civilization is beginning to turn, and it will embrace what it has most feared in recent centuries, its African genesis. This introduction is beautiful. It's funnily reminiscent of Karl Marx, which I figure was intentional. But why don't we just take that as a hopping off point? So what is our African unconscious, and why are we turning back to it?
Well, we're turning back to it, I believe, of necessity. And what is it? Well, you cannot get out of high school here in the United States or reading a popular magazine without coming across the recent studies in archaeology, anthropology, human origins of all kinds, not to know that on some level, human beings, our present species, Homo sapiens, thinking man, we emerged out of Africa. There isn't a whole lot of debate about that anymore. There was up to about maybe 50 years ago, but that's vanished. It's all very clear that we all, you, me, all my relatives, all yours, we all have an African origin. And that has a very clearly outlined archaeological path now. And I merely looked at that information and then made the leap as a psychologist that, well, this is our anthropological and biological and genetic origin. It's probably also the origin of our brains, which means the origins of our minds. And it didn't take me a lot of time, only a couple of years, to flesh out that the basis of our what we call our collective unconscious, that is the unconscious beneath our individual selves, beneath our family consciousness, into our species, has an African genesis also. And that is at the root of everything. And it's really germane to me these days because, as we were saying a little while ago, our present world order is so conflicted and dangerously so around ethnic conflicts over matters of infinitesimal importance in comparison to what we have in common with each other. And I believe the crisis is as deep as our ecological crisis. And I would add one last thing. For the first time, Jason, in the history of our species, we're beginning to leave the planet. We're beginning to leave the planet. And not only are we leaving the planet based upon government defense contracts of one kind or another, we're beginning to do it in terms of commercial exploration. All the recent launchings of private enterprise rockets and so forth circling the planet and everything else indicates that we are now embarking on the commercialization of space. Well, I believe very strongly it's only a matter of time now before we make encounters with other intelligent species out there. And we may have been already. I don't know. I tend to think so. But the point is, we're probably going to. We're not the only intelligent beings in the cosmos, for heaven's sakes. What narcissism is that? There are other intelligent beings. We have to have our act together when we go out there. And if we go out there angry, conflicted, our own house in disorder, that is what we will draw to us. And so I'm just saying that we need to have our act together. If you ever look at some of the, take, for example, science fiction movies of one kind or another, which are mythologies, be it Star Trek or others, they always, there's wars and stuff going on out there, but the human species seems to have figured out who they are at that point.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Star Trek, they're not fighting amongst each other about ethnic stuff.
Yeah.
Hey, wait, that belongs to our childhood, for heaven's sake.
Yes, yeah.
We figured that stuff out because now we're encountering things much more monumental. So that's what I'm arguing for. We need to figure this out because it's really happening. And it's happening right now, just as the worldwide conflicts around ethnic things are ripping peoples and countries apart, whether that be in Palestine and Israel right now, whether that be in certain parts of Africa right now, whether that be in certain parts of Southern Europe right now. It's happening, and it's happened before. It's just that now we have some big weapons. We have some really, really, really big weapons. And we have big weapons and we have adolescent minds.
I think you perfectly summarized the problem. I mean, you mentioned there's so many points I want to jump off with that. I mean, Star Trek for me is like in many ways the perfect vision of what the future could be, and it's something we should go back to. It's like that the importance of Star Trek, particularly I feel the next generation, and also now with the conflict in the Middle East, Deep Space Nine is very, very prescient. But you mentioned space travel and getting our act together, and when you said that, I immediately also thought of AI. Because we will also program all this brutality into AI if it's unchecked.
Don't you know it? Don't you know it? Don't you know it? And AI is an incredibly complicated computing apparatus and system. AI is not AI, by the way, is not conscious. It computes, but it's not conscious. It's not sentient. It does what it does with it, whatever information it does. So in addition to the information that it's feeding itself and we're feeding it, we need to also feed the AI, as you had on your program a while ago, the Diamond Sutra, our sacred books and our sacred texts, which all say the same thing about our origins and who we are, and that we're one family, and that we have an ethical code that we've evolved. It's taken us millennia to do that, but we have. We just aren't very perfect about it. But AI needs to learn that too, and that even though we're a conflicted species, ultimately we're a transcendent species. We are a transcendent species, and that is our greatest, one of our greatest gifts. We are able to constantly go beyond what we were before.
I agree. So what is that? You mentioned the central conflict that is plaguing all of us and driving all of this violence and brutality. How would you want to venture a diagnosis of what that is?
Well, I think part of the problem is that it has become taboo in the modern world to look inside of ourselves deeply and to go beyond our egos and to go beyond our surface ethnicity and apparent racial label, and to recognize the deeper corridors of our own mind, and to see where the continuity is. Our individuality is a little bubble on the surface of this ocean. It's a little bubble, pop. But deep down the depths of our consciousness, which we as individuals are in contact with, is a deep primordial consciousness. And I'm positing that consciousness is luminous, transcendent, and is an evolutionary force, And all of our spiritual traditions, whether it be yoga or some form of Christianity or Buddhism or Islam, all have different pathways into that and try to enunciate that for human beings. All the great spiritual traditions start out in the same place. And then later on, their lesser followers get all academic and splitting hairs about it. But the great founders all say the same thing at different times in our history. And when we are in need, when we are in conflict, when we are most in our dire situations, that is when a new form of us emerges, a new form of religion emerges, a new collective and hierarchical integration of what we've been before. You know, Eric, Jason, every time there is a climate change, a major climate change on the earth, a new form of us has emerged.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, you go back to the first time that we emerged. About 6 to 8 million years ago, we had a common ancestor, and that ancestor died out. But the human, we weren't human. Eventually the hominid, the human path went one direction, and in the other direction, the ape line. Okay, we broke off from them. And then there was has been a steady rise of us through a lot of different things. And each time there's been a major climate change, usually in the eastern part of Africa, yes, a new form of us has emerged. And for a while, we were mostly Australopithecines. And then the climates dried up, lakes appeared and disappeared. We struggled for survival. We did a lot of experimentation. And eventually, that was Australopithecines. There were many variations of them. They died off. And the hominid line grew out of that. Okay, that's us. And eventually, variations of us got higher and higher and more sophisticated. And then with more climate changes at different times, we adapted to it. That's what we can do. We can adapt. And we adapted to them. And eventually we emerged into our present state, Homo sapiens sapiens. You know, and then we left Africa and we went to, we populated all the earth, except for maybe Antarctica, maybe. But we populated the earth. And so we were all over the place. And 200,000 years ago, we still look pretty much the same. We did. We all look pretty much the same. We were short, dark skin, woolly hair, running around, trying to escape the big cats, gathering food, and so on. I mean, we were a scruffy group. And so we look pretty much the same. And what we think of as racial diversification into different, quote, races, unquote, that only began about 35 to 40,000 years ago. Before that time, we all looked the same.
Does there a reason that people agree upon about why that began?
No.
Interesting.
No.
That's it. What a mystery. Okay.
It is a mystery, but we know it did.
Right.
But why did it? Another great mystery. Also another great mystery. About 50,000 years ago, symbolism emerged as a huge wave in our collective consciousness as a species. I mean, we were experimenting around with symbols and little drawings and caves and stuff before that time, for sure, all over the place. But for some reason, 50,000 years ago, all over the planet, symbolism and pottery and paintings and all kinds of stuff emerged.
I wonder if that's
great mystery. We don't know.
I wonder if that's maybe a side effect of increasing tribalism, just because people just use symbols to mark their territory and their tribe.
It may be.
Yeah.
It may be. Very well. Very may. We don't know. That's as good a guess as any. But all we know is that it did happen. So until about 35, 40,000 years ago, we all looked pretty much the same. And about 50,000 years ago, symbolism. And since that time, different huge ethnic groups have come and gone. Many huge civilizations on Earth have come and gone. And the last great civilization we know of has left scattered reminders of itself. And that is the one that has its head reared in certain parts of Egypt, which I think about 10,500 BCE. And the reason we know it was a very sophisticated civilization is because the Sphinx, the body of a lion, the head of a man, looks directly into the vernal equinox of Leo the lion on the vernal equinox, 10,500 BCE. That's no accident.
Interesting.
That's no accident.
I believe the pyramids are also, or at least I read something at some point, that the pyramids are lined up to Orion.
Yes.
And predict the levels of the Nile to the star Sirius, which is I don't think people now could do that. Certainly not off the fly.
Right. and so who did that? Obviously, some combination of our ancestors and maybe some other influences. But we know. And after that, the ancient Kemetic Egyptians refer to that as their Zep Tepi, or splendid time of the first time. It means they record their civilization from then. And it arose, I should say, began falling after the beginning of the ending of the last ice age. Because when the last ice age ended, all that water that had been sucked up into the glaciers and so forth melted and it swept across the earth. And it buried lots of civilizations. At the bottom of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, there are cities.
What cities? Wait, what cities are?
There are huge city complexes that were
I
buried
didn't know
by
that.
women.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And the same off the Sea of Japan and the same off of India. Yes, there are.
Wow.
So many of our civilizations have come and gone. We are the last, or I should say, we're the most recent iteration of that. And as you can see from the evening news, we're not guaranteed to be permanent, are we?
Not in 2024, it seems.
Yeah, we're not. But we have reached high points in the past. We've fallen, we've climbed back up again, knocked ourselves down again, and now we've climbed back up again. So we're in many ways a very ancient and interesting species, and all of that is in our DNA. All of that is in our DNA. Yes, and this is what I meant by we share infinitely more with each other that we have in common beneath our surface ethnic appearances. Because race has no real biological reality to it. I mean, it really doesn't. I mean, it has political reality for sure.
Yes.
It has economic reality, that's for sure, of course. But it doesn't have any scientific basis, you know?
I think we've only realized that since the 60s.
In the 60s, yeah. I mean, we realize it at least scientifically.
That's not very long to end thousands of years of tribalism.
No,
it's only been 60 years.
And it's not going to end. It's not going to end our tribalism. We don't have to get rid of tribals or ethnicity. We don't have to. We just have to keep that stuff together and under control.
Yeah.
Ethnicity in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It's a variation based upon our adaptation to certain climactic and other situations. And it's totally okay. It doesn't imply inferiority, superiority, or anything else like that. It's an adaptation of our species to certain situations. You know, when the Africans migrated and moved up into Europe, they underwent certain surface, and they're only surface, differentiations in order to adapt. The hair got longer in the head, you know, because it's also better for keeping heat in the body. You know, nose got longer to warm the air coming into the body. Conversely, the noses are shorter in Africa because you disperse heat. I mean, there are lots of adaptations. They're not speciations.
Yeah. They're
adaptations. And the reason that this is important is that here in the U.S., we now are confronting people who are frightened that somehow the essence of them is going to be replaced by something. No, we're all going through adaptations. We're all going through adaptations. And the essence of us is not on the surface. It's deep within our souls and within our hearts.
That's really interesting. I mean, yeah, people do have that, or very much people are manipulated into having that paranoia as well, because it serves people who want to draw boundaries and lines and things like that, and get control.
Control power.
Yes. I was just at the gym, and I had this kind of thought popped into my head that, you know, we hear the phrase all the time, you know, learn the lessons of history or you're doomed to repeat them. And then I realized, well, actually, we're going to repeat them anyways, because history is a product of human nature, and human nature doesn't change, or it changes very, very slowly.
It changes very, very slowly. Yeah. It changes very, very slowly. We're not the same as we were a million years ago. We're not. I mean, even a million years ago, we all craved family relations. Human beings have always been family grouped kind of creatures, you know. And out of the family grew, tribes and cities and villages and all that sort of thing. But that family experimentation happened in Africa, and we took it with us all over the place. And we still have it within us. So it's not a bad thing at all. It's a very important thing. It's deeper than our individual consciousness. But sometimes we fought great wars over power. We haven't. We're fighting them again today. We're on the verge of doing that again today with, again, big weapons now.
Yeah, and sneaky weapons too. Psychological warfare, biological warfare, genetic. God knows what they have. We just don't know.
Really.
I want to talk about Africa a lot, actually, because one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you is I seem to get all of my best leads from random thoughts that pop into my head, and I just had this idea going over and over in my head prior to seeing your book, that I was just thinking about Africa, and I was thinking, this is probably not my original idea. I probably heard this from somebody and thought it was my idea, but well, it's certainly not my original idea because you wrote a whole book about it, which I then found, which is, in a way, does Africa represent the unconscious of some of the world? And what I mean by that is, like, Africa, everything from, it's way bigger on a map than it's been put. It's the cradle of civilization. There's almost infinite cultures in there. There's infinite history, Egypt, Mansa Musa, all of this stuff. And yet no one at least in the mainstream media, nobody really talks about it unless it's something negative. We're not taught the history of Africa except for little things glancing over it. And it's just like, how can the biggest continent on Earth just be put in the blind spot, just put in the unconscious? And in a sense, does that mean it also exerts more power and control over the world than anything else? Because we know the unconscious is so much more potent than whatever is consciously processing. So then I saw your book came across my path, and I was like, well, this is great. So I want to talk about it. I want to go back to, let's talk about one of the things that most interests me is that you hint at, or you go towards in both of these books, is the idea of Africa as also the root of all religions. And I definitely want to talk about that. So I'm not quite sure where to hop off from that, but.
Well, I would only say that at the very beginning, why has it reached this particular state or condition politically? And I would just point out that one, it hasn't always been this way, but the other is that whoever wins gets to write history, right? And in the last 400 years, the West, meaning essentially Europe, won the last great war, and turned much of, or large parts, not all, but large parts of Africa, particularly the coastal regions, into regions where people were taken and turned into slaves, both by Europeans and Arabs, and also Africans selling other Africans. What has been forgotten is there used to be huge empires and civilizations in Africa, the West Coast. And when they fell, starting around the mid 12th and 13th century, and continued into decline into the 16th century, that is when the European slave trade began. And it's very difficult for the modern mind to mistreat or enslave someone that they feel is their equal. You can't do that. You have to denigrate a person. You have to denigrate a culture. You need to do that. Otherwise, there's too much of a conflict in your mind. And so that is essentially what happened. And all things associated with Africa became lesser or demeaned in the last 300 or so years, not exclusively. I mean, there were scholars in Europe who pointed out, no, Africans are the origins of everything. And in fact, origin of our civilizations and everything. In fact, for a long time, until around the 1800s or so, in Europe, the model of civilization from the Renaissance to about the 1800s in Europe was Egypt. Egypt was thought of as the model and the goal of civilization. The pyramids, the buildings, in Europe idolized it, And then with the penetration into Africa by Napoleon and others, they got there and they didn't find any white people who built the civilization. All they saw was Africans. And so all of a sudden there was a crisis among the intelligentsia. And so that's when all of a sudden Greece and Rome became the models of civilization and culture. It was a flip. Because otherwise, how can you think of your person that you've enslaved as the creator of your civilization? Right. It's too much of a head mess up.
Do you know there's this guy named Akala in the UK? I believe he's at the University of Oxford, but he talks quite a lot about this. He pointed something out, which is just about this moment, and and Europeans coming to Africa, and now when like there's all these kind of alien theories about the pyramids and things like this, and he just said like, white people are so racist that they would sooner believe that aliens built the pyramids than black people. Or it's just like, when you put it like that, that's pretty ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah. And if there were some alien contact, that doesn't mean that they actually built them. That means there may have been cooperation. Who knows? But most people, that, it is easier to believe that than to think that these African peoples who used to be your slaves did this. So that is the crisis we're currently in. That is somewhat receded somewhat because the inevitability of the African liberation has happened largely, not completely by any means, but Africa is colonized today primarily economically and politically. It's not. There are no huge numbers of British or French troops in Africa anymore. There are no Iberian Peninsula navies and so forth parading around the perimeter of Africa or going in and taking gold and silver out. No. Today, the colonization is economic and financial. So you have the Russians in the middle of Africa.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wait, where?
Oh, yeah. In the Congo region and other regions. Yes.
Wow.
Because they've been brought in they've been introduced by, they're propping up corrupt leaders in Africa and in exchange for huge amounts of mineral resources. That's what we used to do. The United States, we go into different countries in South America and other places, Philippines, and we would prop up, failing country economies or set up our own puppet regimes, and we'd extract huge amounts of wealth from it. So the Russians are just doing that now.
Yeah, it very much seems to be the colonization model today seems to be the, outside of propaganda colonization, is the kind of economic hitman model where you go in, collapse the economy, and then offer predatory loans for the World Economic Forum. So people are just enchained. I know China is also doing the same thing, right? I'm not totally up on what's happening there, but they're really moving into
the same thing. They're taking advantage of the situation. And, this is what human beings have been doing for who knows how long, untold millennia. But yeah, the Chinese are doing that now too. Ultimately, I believe it will crash because you can't continue to have the kind of communication networks that we have without at some point people realizing the jig is up. You can't keep doing this. But it can continue for a long period of time, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like Africa is also really blowing up in a good way economically. Ghana is really, becoming a technology hub and all this stuff. And it seems like there's quite a lot of extremely exciting stuff happening.
There is. But that doesn't make the news.
Right.
What makes the news is pictures of starving people.
Yeah.
In refugee camps. That is the image that the ruling socioeconomic order wants to perpetuate.
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
Because it's easier to exploit that way. That way, when you're offering foreign assistance to someplace, people say, oh, yeah, they really need it. When actually your foreign assistance oftentimes is also selling guns in exchange for uranium, gold, diamonds, and so forth.
Does that include NGOs and private charities and that type of thing?
Yes, to a much less extent. To a much less extent. Those are often used as covers, actually. Some good work, you see? See how we're helping? And that's true, they are. But the overwhelming majority of them are just plain getting rich.
I see.
Hey, this is the kind of species we are.
Well, let's talk about
all of us.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I say all of us because people forget that during the slave trade from the 16-ish hundreds until the late 1700s, all those Africans brought from central areas of Africa, they weren't brought there by European armies that invaded and dragged them out. They got there by being enchained by other Africans.
Yeah, my mentor...
So human greed and mendacity is pretty universal.
My mentor, Genesis Peorage, went to Benin in, I think, 2014 or 2015, and they did a film called The Bite of the Twin, where they were looking at the Dahomey culture and the roots of Voudon. And but they went to that gate in Benin where slaves were sold and picked up, and they said it was just unbelievably heavy.
Gate of no return.
Let's talk about the religion aspects. Do you think, I mean, this is probably has an obvious answer because humans are from Africa, but I'm sure you have the sense that, our religion and our esoteric religion probably also all come from there as well. And there's so many interesting things to talk about there, from the Dahomey, as I just mentioned, but also Egypt, and my personal obsession, the Dogon tribe and their knowledge of Sirius B and all of that, which is apparent, as far as I can see, apparently maybe the source of everything. Although I believe there was, I think at least, I don't know who, but somebody had the theory at some point that the Dogon could have been the astronomers in ancient Egypt that may have migrated after kind of things started to fall apart.
That's part of their mythology. Yes.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yes, that they were.
I didn't know that.
They draw their origin to pre-dynastic Egypt, and they said they were in pre-dynastic Egypt, and that after the different wars and so forth in Egypt, they migrated out of Egypt, went west, and reestablished themselves in the Mali region. So that is their direct testimony. And there have been many migrations out of Egypt. There were many customs that are similar, but underneath even the customs, there is a religious and spiritual and biogenetic integration of all of this in various kinds of religious practices. And the most telling one is of the practice of what's called, depending on what culture you're in ancient Kemetic Egypt, the Uraeus, in Dravidian India, southern India, before the Aryan invasions, it was the Kundalini, and then other cultures have different names for it. But what it is essentially is a recognition and a worship of the energy that moves along the spine up into different higher levels of the brain, and eventually awakens the individual. And this biogenetic force is a real phenomenon, and it is universal. And you can find it expressed by the shamans in Peru, by the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Everybody has a different name for it, but if you look closely, it's the same thing. And by the way, it's the same technology. It involves stimulation of the spinal line, and using different kinds of breathing exercises and so forth, of drawing this energy up higher and higher through the spinal line until she reaches the cerebral cortex, and then various levels within the cerebral cortex until she, quote, exits. And we have a direct symbol of that. Every time somebody goes to see a physician in the U.S., they implicitly acknowledge that. There's the symbol of the physician.
Explain that. Has always blown my mind. Like, explain that, please. Like, what? How?
It's a staff. It's a staff. And the staff is crisscrossed 7 times by 2 serpents, and those 2 serpents reach the top of this brain, and then they disappear, the staff, and they take flight with wings. That's a direct symbolic representation of the awakening of that primordial energy through the human spinal line, which makes it also a neurological phenomenon, all the way up to the top of the brain and above. Our internal spine is neural tissue.
I did not know that.
Yes, it comes from the back of the brain all the way down to almost the tip of the spine. And that's the symbol of Kundalini also.
I want to go ahead.
And it's composed of a neural tissue that absorbs light, essentially bio light. the inside of our skulls, we have our brain. There's no sunlight that gets in there. It's in the inside of our brain. The surface of our brain and critical areas of our brain are all dark. The surface of the brain is dark. It's neuromelanin. And that goes all the way to the surface of the brain and critical areas of the brain, all the way down the spinal line, all the way down through it. And every yoga practitioner that you're going to meet will tell you that. That's the whole basis of yoga.
I agree.
All the different schools.
It's agree
the basis
completely.
Of Taoism. It's the basis of Christianity. It's the basis of Islam.
Yep.
The esoteric dimensions. And not only is it a, quote, spiritual, theological phenomenon, unquote, but it's also a neurological, biological phenomenon. It is the evolutionary force that is captured by these different disciplines.
Totally. I completely agree with you and vouch for this. I mean, I've done a lot of Kriya Yoga, including in India, and a lot of esoteric yoga. And so everything you're saying is correct. I also teach, various yogic and magical practices. And my students quite regularly have Kundalini awakenings without even realizing what's happening or intentionally doing it, which I then coach them through. So yeah, it's real. And it's like when you go through something, you can always kind of say like, well, maybe I was making that up. But then when you see other people going through it after doing specific things, and it's like the same for everyone every time, suddenly it's a new thing. Yeah.
It's a science.
It is.
An ancient science. And the most well-known, I'm sure you're aware of that, of exponents of the Kriya Yoga are Yogananda, but also his teacher,
Yukaswara. Yep. That's my lineage. That's my lineage. Yeah.
Yes, and it is a form of Kundalini Yoga. Their technique and methodology is a little bit different than some of the others, but it is the same subtle anatomy of the body and the same techniques of the use of the breath and the three internal bodily locks, bringing that energy sequentially up. Yes.
So
it's a neurological phenomenon in addition to a physical phenomenon.
So I'm super curious about the African, the roots of this in Africa. I know I've seen some stuff from, books on the Kemetic tradition where they're talking about this, and they're even talking about like some of the statues of the gods in Egypt being yoga poses, which I think even the Golden Dawn was hip to. So please, I don't really know anything about that side of things though, so I'm super interested.
Well, there were. The indigenous Kemetic Egyptians and folks. Kemetic means the Egyptians who were primarily African, as opposed to those who became Egyptian after the crossing over of the Semitic peoples into Egypt. Okay, so it's the original builders of the pyramids. The Kemetic Egyptians, they practiced certain postures, and certain of their statues manifested that. There's a very famous one that is a fusion of both that and also their understanding of the shapes. There are 5 fundamental shapes. We call them Platonic shapes. Well, they were discovered and explicated mostly in early Egypt. Well, in one of the statues anyway, it shows a cube, which is one of the classic 5 fundamental shapes, with a human brain, a human mind head coming out of it. Their mathematics was certainly very sophisticated, but they understood it differently the way that we do. They didn't separate their mathematics from the operation of the mind. We kind of do. They didn't. And they also...
That's really interesting.
They also made use, and this is an interesting how folks in South Africa and West Africa picked up on this and took it further, and also to some extent in Dravidian India. But certain rhythmic movements and incantations focused into the body in certain ways will also awaken that energy. Like in South Africa, there are people, they call the Kum people, and their religious rituals involve staying up until you're very tired, but dancing moving the feet, stimulating the feet, till eventually the movement of the feet on the ground stimulates the lower part of the spine, and it stimulates that energy to awaken all the way up.
Huh.
Okay?
Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting. Interesting.
In West Africa, there are also similar techniques, but their adaptation of it was sometimes more symbolic. What do I mean by that? There used to be a ritual where one would practice to the gods and goddesses, and then there was a central ceremony in which a person would sit on a box, and inside of the box was a living serpent. The thought was that the energy of the serpent would rise up through your spine all the way up to the head. And their understanding was that the earth was composed of a serpent with 3.5 coils above the earth and 3.5 coils deep within the earth. Well, I say it's a biological and neurological phenomenon because the structure of our brains, the human brain, is in a coil of 3.5. There's the brain stem, midbrain limbic system, cortex, and then a partially developed cortex, neocortex. So that's 3.5 times. And in the same thing, you find the same symmetry and the same symbolism in ancient Dravidian India. You find it in Peru. You find it among the Aztecs. In other words, in every spiritual tradition that involves an actual physical discipline, you see that serpent coil 3.5 times around with the head down. And your job as a spiritual aspirant is to awaken that energy and point her upward, which is what you do in the Kriya Yoga.
Yes.
That's what it is. And so it's both a physical practice, yes, but it also is a neurological reality. And that is based upon our anthropological biogenetic history of millions of years. And it all comes out of that African context.
That's interesting. I mean, the Dravidians in South India also migrated directly from North Africa, maybe not North Africa, but Africa. Not North Africa.
More like South and West and East Africa, yes.
Okay.
They migrated over.
Interesting.
Thousands of years, but that's what they did, yes.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So we carry that, all of us, we carry that with us collectively. And beneath our surface ethnic reality is a much deeper reality that we all share this in common. Yes,
yeah, I mean, this is it's esoteric, but it's also so pertinent to exoteric world events in the sense that, shortly before this call, we were talking about Israel, Palestine. So much of the apocalyptic theology around the Middle East is wrapped up in not just the Book of Revelation, but part of it, from the evangelical Christian side is the Book of Revelation and the attempts to enact that. Well, the Book of Revelation, if you study this stuff, is obviously also about Kundalini Yoga. When they talk about the 7 churches and the 7 churches and all this stuff and the signs, and it's like, okay, so it's like perhaps a tragedy here of the world is that a lot of these texts were written in twilight language or code by people who were having these experiences, and then people who had no idea about any of that got hold of it and said, okay, we need to destroy the Holy Land to bring back Jesus to the third temple and all this stuff. And it's like, well, no, it's a metaphor, but you're missing the point. People miss the point.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that we're on the verge, however, collectively as a species of rediscovering that, partially brought on by 2 crises. One is the climate ecological crisis, which it will demand of us, whether we like it or not, kicking and screaming. It will demand a change on our part, or we will not survive. It's getting to that point. I mean, last summer, in large parts of Europe, for long weeks of period, temperatures of 100 degrees plus, and their buildings are not air conditioned. Many of their buildings are not air conditioned, and it'll be demanded. Look at what's happening out in the certain parts of the Southwest in our country, the U.S. of A. Certain parts of the country are simply uninhabitable.
Right.
I'm not making a big thing of it right now, but I was out in Arizona. Was it last summer? Last summer, and at a conference, and I got off the plane, and I went through the airport, and then I got out of the airport to get my ride to the facility. Whoa! It was like 110 degrees. I said, what? So I get in the air-conditioned taxi. We drive out to the desert. I get out of the taxi to get into the hotel. Whoa! It was so hot. I mean, inconceivably hot. And it's just getting hotter and hotter and hotter. So we're going to be compelled to change.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think millions of us are going to just get wiped out.
Yeah. I mean,
before we change, but we have to, and we usually change when we have to.
Well, we definitely have to. I mean, I think, somebody pointed out to me, Daniel Pinchbeck just pointed out to me, the Middle East, the conflict zone in the Middle East, like that might not even be habitable by humans at all in 20 years.
Right now,
and, the disturbing thing about increasing temperatures too, is it increases violence. It's like, like I lived in LA for 11 years. You can observe this firsthand when it gets get that hot. So
yeah, I used to live in LA.
Okay.
People they're on the freeway and the cars are stopped and that's it.
Yeah. That's it. So, and I think it's a big part of climate change is clearly part of the increasing racial tensions, because part of it is people are trying to turn their countries into fortresses from climate refugees, but that's going to be the whole world. There's not, it's just, we're going to have to deal with it. You can't just put your head in the sand, because it's going to be everywhere.
No amount of troops on the southern border is going to stop that.
Right.
No amount.
Right.
No amount. And the seas are rising, and we are going to have, and some countries will simply disappear in the Pacific. But we will change, but only when we have a gun to our head. And then we'll have to. And there are countries and economies and even private businesses and enterprises that are rushing to do something about it. And they're figuring out a way to make this also profitable, which is great.
That is great. Yeah.
It is great.
Yeah.
But we have to do it. And I have no idea how this situation in the Middle East between Palestine and Israel is going to be resolved, and maybe not resolved, and maybe just rises and slows down, but it's now quite lethal, and it's going on as we speak.
Well,
we speak.
Yeah, and is deeply weighing on me to the point where I've had to just take breaks for my own mental health, because it's in a serious way. Like it's not.
It's so painful to watch. It's so painful to watch, and I don't see any solution from their point of view of what they're saying. Maybe there's private conversations going on somewhere, but all the public discourses and presentations and posturing indicate that there's no resolution in sight. So what's going to happen? I don't know.
Yeah, but every time I get online, it's horrible. It's like every time I look at the news, every time I look at Twitter, all I get is just, I've never seen people this hateful and divided. And that's saying something, because people are pretty hateful and divided already. And, the pressure to take sides, the people retaliating against people who took the side they don't like. It's just like, come on, this is just madness. And I think that, to focus on a positive, I think you kind of hint at many times in your work that, or not hint, you say that in a way embracing our African unconscious is a ray of hope, and I agree with you. But I'm curious what you mean by that.
Recognizing that we share, and I do mean share, a deeper identity with each other, and that I may have preferences for this or that, spiritually speaking, and you may have preferences for this, spiritually speaking, because it fits your body differently, and that's totally okay. But the deep goal in both situations is to raise a primordial energy up to the spinal line, regardless of what we kind of want to call it. And one, and two, every one of our religious traditions, no exceptions to the rule. Every one of our great spiritual traditions points out that we are all one family, literally, spiritually, biologically, and otherwise. And it points that out. And now we are sciences, anthropology, genetics, serological studies, blood studies, all pointed to the same thing also. So all the stuff is right there in front of us. It really is. And the climate crisis is compelling us to recombine, reconfigure all of this. And those of us who figure that out will survive and thrive and transcend. And those who don't will do as others in the past. They will fade away into history.
Yeah.
This is the great crisis of our species right now. And it's both a moral crisis, obviously. It's an economic crisis. But it's also a spiritual crisis. And ultimately, will be a biological test of our capacity as a species. And some of us are going to get wiped out, unfortunately.
What's happening right now.
I'm a believer in the soul. And I believe that we come back.
I do too, against all rational, better thought. Yes.
Well, the rational is only one particular very useful way to understand the world process, but it by no means,
yes.
all of the world is not understood in rational terms.
Yes, most of it, barely any of it is understood. Yeah.
It's a tool we've developed, and it's a great tool. But it doesn't.
But it's a tool. It's a tool. That's the most important bit. You shouldn't let it use you. Right. I think that esotericism, whatever. I mean, there's no perfect word for it. Spirituality, whatever. Like real esotericism has a big role to play in this because which is why I've spent so much of my life kind of pushing it. I think that. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. All mystics come from the same country. I think that was what was that? That was. I forget the guy's name, Meister Eckhart, I think. And he's, I think that's totally true. And, example, I've known you for like 57 minutes only, and we're already connecting and talking about some of the deepest neurological, spiritual experiences people can have. And in total agreement, we're experiencing the same thing. I didn't, I haven't talked to you till 57, an hour ago, and yet we're already on the same page. And I think that's the power of, just even if you just want to focus on Kriya Kundalini, just that aspect alone. I mean, once you get into that, you see, well, this underlies everything. And people are killing each other over the symbols they use to describe this thing. It's like they're killing each other over the menus without eating the food.
That's essential. It's a good way to put it. Yeah. Because if you eat the food, you'll go, yeah.
So I think
we are afraid of losing the spasm of identity that we have, even though we know ultimately it will fade away. That is why our salvation as a species will probably be that when we see how climate is going, we start getting really terrified of it, that people turn to the deeper roots of their religion, not the hateful parts of it, but the deeper parts of it. And when they do, they will discover the common faith, the common soul.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I think that this year is a huge turning point for a lot of reasons, but one of them is this is the hottest. 2023 was the hottest year in recorded history, as far as I'm aware, and I sure felt it in Texas. So I think I think that my sense is like you don't really hear Republicans denying climate change anymore. Maybe they do, but I haven't been hearing it, and so it's like I think it's so in front of literally in front of their faces that they're kind of. They can't deny it.
They can't deny it. And it's not a matter of I'll sit in my backyard and the climate won't get me, but it'll get you. No.
Right.
No.
Yeah, and it's causing, I mean, like...
It doesn't care.
It doesn't care. I mean, like, I was one of the people that left California in 2020 when it was just like, because there's no escape from the fires, from the, it's just becoming uninhabitable and minorly uninhabitable. Obviously, it's still habitable, but it's becoming, the climate is just becoming so much more extreme. And that's happening all over the world. Extreme. So, and it's happening
all over the world. And probably when we're compelled to recognize that, unfortunately, in the name of our own salvation, we're probably going to have to do some pretty draconian things.
Like what?
In terms of limiting the use of carbon fuels. I mean, seriously limiting the use of carbon fuels. When there was a crisis back in the 70s, was it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. We were supposedly running out of gasoline. Every other day, you were able to get your car filled, mandating that internal combustion engines be increasingly more efficient and expensive, and subsidizing electronic vehicles, we will have to massively expand solar and other ways of harvesting energy from the earth. The carbon-based ones are only one. There's tremendous energy solar. There's huge amounts of energy geothermal. And there's even, done the right way, safe nuclear energy. So there are all kinds of alternatives. The ocean waves create energy.
Yeah, with the
exploit on a massive level Tesla technology of drawing energy out of the center of the earth. The guy who created many of the wonders of the world today, Nikola Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
He devised ways of extracting energy out of the center of the earth and transmitting it. Yes, he did.
Yeah,
except
no one acted on it.
Well, there was a big war between Tesla and Edison.
Mm-hmm.
And with Teslas, it wasn't immediately clear how you made money from it. But with Edison, it was.
Yeah.
Edison won.
Yeah.
Con Edison won. Okay. But now we need many of the insights and creations of Tesla. So we've got to, there are technological ways to greatly ameliorate this, but we're probably going to have to go through a really bad decade. I mean, a really bad decade.
At least. Yeah. I mean,
yeah, before we shift. We will.
Well, I think the shift is happening. I mean, like, for instance, California is trying to go 100% EVs, electric vehicles, by 2030. But there's another angle to that, too, which is like, those are, okay, they don't burn gas, but in order to make those, they need rare earth minerals that they're raiding Africa to get. So they're not necessarily better for the environment. And they're having to do extractive imperialism to get the...
Right. And at the bottom of the sea. And the same with extracting some of these rare earths at the bottom of the sea.
Oh, I didn't know about that part.
Yeah. How will that affect the circulation of the currents? We don't know that yet. So, but there are ones that are relatively neutral. Waves of the sea create energy, and that can be harnessed. Geothermal energy. We barely scratch the surface with that. That's possible. Mm-hmm. Fusion technologies. Yep. So we have a lot of alternatives, but we have to double down on exploring those and tell the oil and carbon people, you can still be millionaires and billionaires. You just have to do it a different way.
Right.
I'm not going to take your money, but you have to go in a different direction because this will kill us.
Yes.
It is killing.
I think a lot of for instance, Shell and a lot of those companies are putting a tremendous amount of research into that. And you could call that greenwashing, but I think that it's, they recognize what's coming too. I mean, they have to protect their bottom line. And it's interesting. It's, it's like for the climate, I used to work in advertising for doing what I suppose people would call greenwashing, but pushing sustainable corporate programs with things. And one of the things I notice is it's often like the way I think one of the best ways to get through the ecological crisis is to remove morality completely from it. Like people say like, well, like you were saying, profit's a great thing. I agree. One of the things I notice is a lot of times it's like some of the worst people that you want to work with. For instance, Las Vegas, run by the mafia. But they knew 15, 20 years ago that this was coming, and they've been working steadily to turn it into a sustainable city. It's like, well, that's good. Who cares that it's the mafia? It's like, this is planet Earth. It's going to require everyone,
Yeah. If we don't survive, the mafia doesn't survive either.
Right.
I mean, there are always going to be criminal elements in everything. I mean, come on. Ancient Egyptian and Roman times, there were folks who weren't most savory people, but the name of the game is the survival and the transcendence of our species. And however we get there, sometimes it's in an enlightened democratic way, sometimes it's a different way. But as long as we eventually get there and our species triumphs and survives, because that is what we do. And eventually we do come back to a moral center. We do. We're a moral creature also. We are. I mean...
that's reassuring.
Well, some things you can't do today that we used to be able to do 500 years ago.
Like what?
You can't kill a person because you own them anymore.
You might be able to in Saudi Arabia.
You have to do it, but you have to do it by government, and it has to be sanctioned by supposedly religious law.
Okay.
You just can't do it.
Okay.
Okay. And you can't rape someone in your household because you feel it that day, like some Roman.
I think that might depend on where you live in the world.
That might be depending on where you live in the world, and it's much less than it used to be. But can you still do it? Yeah. Is it cool? No.
Yeah, so we've really improved. I mean, it's just like it's really easy to get hopeless and bleak, but I mean, even if you just look 100 years ago, it's like even in my lifetime, it's like the amount of improvement of things. Like, yes, every improvement brings with it its own dark side. Like social media is a perfect example, right? But but when I think back to like growing up in the 80s, seeing people dying of AIDS, and it's just like like no one ever talks about that anymore, and everyone was convinced everyone was going to die of AIDS. Now you never even no one even seems to care anymore, which has its own downsides.
We found ways around it, and we found a way to limit it. And we're going to do the same thing with every other disease that pops up. But it means there's collateral damage. But we're a triumphant species. We adapt. We keep coming back. There have been plagues in the past that have wiped out a third of our civilizations, and we've come back. The bubonic plagues in the Middle Ages, the Black Death, wiped out a third of Europe. Oh, talk about a dark time.
Yeah.
They came back.
Yeah, I mean, even World War II, I don't know what, 50, 100 million people died, something like that. But a few years later, all those numbers had easily been replenished in world population. Right. So even the most apocalyptic, obviously we don't want to repeat that, but like it's not a good thing. But even the most apocalyptic moments, it doesn't even seem to make a dent in the overall human project.
We find a way, and we're going to find a way out of this ethnic crisis of identity and this climate crisis. Not without a lot of pain, but we're going to, and we're going to reach out, and we're going to travel to the stars. We are.
Absolutely. What role do you feel that Africa has to? What role will Africa play in building the future?
I think the turning back to Africa and our primal values and primal vision will be very important. What does that mean concretely? It means that in Africa, the primal understanding in most philosophies in Africa and religious traditions is that the world is alive, that the cosmos is alive and conscious, and that we can interact with it, and that it's a spiritual phenomenon. Doesn't mean it's not physical also. Doesn't mean it's not also rational. Doesn't mean it's also not scientific. But the fundamental assumption is that the world is alive, and we are intricately an integral part of that. Much the same as in the deeper corridors of yoga, recognition that consciousness is the fundamental reality. In Africa, they don't call it necessarily "quote unquote" consciousness, unquote, per se. It's more like a philosophy of personalism, or personal essence pervades everything. Africa used to get a lot of criticism in the West, particularly from certain philosophical circles dominated by logical positivism and other approaches to the world order that way, that would recognize that a tree would have a spirit in it, and it would be like, animism, regressive thinking, archaic reasoning, paleontological thought. No.
It's also reality.
It's also reality. And it's alive. And you know who else is saying that these days? Many of the corridors of quantum mechanics that indicate that consciousness pervades even the material world at the most subtle levels. When there are these experiments called slit screen experiments, where they're determining whether a light is a particle or a wave, etc., but also when it goes through this slit screen, where does it go? And it looks like even at that level, that these quanta seem to make decisions about which direction they go. There is. And there are lots of other experiments like that, hard experiments, that lends credence to the notion that at the most fundamental level, consciousness is there. That doesn't mean your ego is there. It means consciousness is there. Like you walk outside of your home there and you see a dog. Well, that dog, is conscious. He's not conscious in the way you're conscious, but he's
obviously conscious. Yeah.
He's obviously conscious. And then so is that bird. And on some level, so is that caterpillar.
Or rocks even, I would say.
And rocks.
Yeah.
They all partake of consciousness on various levels. And that understanding of the world process makes the world ultimately sacred.
I agree. And I think that, in my own experiments with religion, it's like, I feel that the religions that really start from that understanding, I think to a large extent, African religion, Hinduism, a lot of Buddhism, not all of it, but a lot of Buddhism, indigenous religion in general, I think is all kind of anything that starts from that perspective is pretty chill and accepting of people and enjoyable, and is mostly about how to live a good life. Then you get into the ones that are like, we have to kill everyone so that XYZ person can come back. It's like, okay, this is extremely uncool. So I feel that the future is very much in the, to put, I guess, more academic language on that, the immanent instead of the transcendent religions, because it's all about what's here and right in front of our faces. And in many ways, you could argue that, and not just religion, belief systems that encourage a separation from the world, or may have led to the ecological crisis in the first place.
Well, yeah, that's true. And at a certain point in our history as a species, we needed to, quote, objectify, unquote, large parts of nature to manipulate it and have some sense of control over it. We did. Otherwise, we wouldn't have gotten out of the savannas. We needed to learn how to master fire. We needed to do it. Instead of being awed by it, we needed to learn how to create it, sustain it. We needed to do the same with water. We needed to do the same eventually with chemicals, one kind or another. We needed to figure out how to order things. And so we created or discovered mathematics in various forms. We needed to objectify nature in order to, quote, progress. Okay. But at a certain point, we have to also realize that our Frankenstein creation can also turn back on us. And, science is a very rarefied tool, but it is a tool. And we have to use it. Science is no more the truth than deep mysticism and spirituality is. They're on a co-footing, at least for me. And they should be able to hold hands.
Well, you said something earlier, which I 1000% agree with, which is, we have big, big weapons, but adolescent consciousnesses. I mean, Yogananda said something similar, and I think that that's the core. And this is kind of why I do what I do, at least, which is like, okay, there are actual for instance, Kundalini yoga. One of the things, the ideas you get from that is spirituality can be trained. Western people, I think, have this idea inherited from Christianity that you're only spiritual if you're the one son of God. And It's like, no, you can actually train spirituality and meditation just like going to the gym. Kriya yoga, Kundalini yoga, anything like that, even just basic yoga, like they are all, you can train it just like you would train any other skill. And it's like, why don't we start doing that if we're handling AI, space travel, nuclear weapons, biological, genetic warfare, all that? Maybe they should go together.
Well, it's very empirical. Kriya yoga is very empirical. Do this, notice that.
Absolutely.
This, watch that.
Absolutely.
Very empirical, very causal, very experientially validating. So there's a methodology. And isn't that the core of science? A methodology? Do this, notice that. Collect data based on data. Do this.
And then have other people repeat your experiment and get the same results, which
I've
proven to myself again and again and again and again, with some of these things. So yeah, that's absolutely.
Science. That's science. That's a science. It's a different kind of science than biochemistry. It's a different kind of science than oceanography. It's a different kind of science than astronomy. but it is a science.
I think for me, it's like some of these things, like even Kriya Yoga, it's almost like learning to use your body in the way that's supposed to use it. Not to be crude, but I mean, in many senses, it's kind of similar to finding out how sex works in your early teen, preteen or early teen years or earlier. And then all of a sudden you're like, wow, my body can do this thing. It's kind of similar with, it's actually, same spinal channel. So, extremely, extremely interesting. Maybe I want to take a slightly different tack, though. One thing that I am super interested in, and I notice you talk about in your books, is you have a whole appendix on it in our African unconscious, is the migration of some of the African traditions to the New World. Like you talk about the most obvious one being the various Yoruban traditions, Voudon, Santeria, Candomblé, all the various forms of it throughout the New World, North, South, Central America. I would talk about that process. I mean, how much do you think survived? How much was mixed with Catholicism? Did it become something totally different?
There was a syncretic fusion of many of the disciplines and rituals from West Africa, in particular, in the middle of Africa, in the mid-coastal regions of Africa, where much of the slave trade came. And in order to be allowed to practice the Christianized religion, it had to dovetail with other practices so that it was not seen. In other words, your original practices had to be hidden within the cloak of Christianity. Otherwise, you would not be able to practice. And so that is what happened. And many of the African gods, quote unquote gods and goddesses, became, quote, saints, unquote, of one kind or another. St. Christopher, St. Bartholomew. And they became associated with various other kinds of energies in nature. And so that syncretism was very important. And it was not all lost by any means, but it was translated and integrated. And it had to do that in order to survive. Right now, in different parts of South America, you find the Voudon traditions as Candomblé in some areas, other names in other areas, but underneath it is the same notion and the same gods and the same notion of being, quote, possessed or taken over by the living spirit, by the Loa, by an energy fusion. And very often that energy fusion took the form of a serpentine goddess, And it was dangerous at times to practice it because it was very evocative, and many of the slave owners were frightened by what they saw. And for good reason.
Yeah.
Because
there was the whole slave revolt in Haiti with the involving Voudon and all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it began in a Rada rite. They were practicing in a Rada Voudon rite, and it just took off from there. And that's when the rebellion began.
Isn't Rada like the more relaxed one, and Petro is the more fiery and explosive one? Or maybe I'm wrong about that.
They're both intense. And depending on who you like and who you read, you might lean toward one or toward the other. But we know it began in a Voudon energized rite. And isn't it interesting that since that time, even though the peoples of Haiti did kick the French out, Haiti has never gotten on its own feet very long?
Yes. Well, as Genesis used to point out to me, America has never forgiven Haiti for that.
Right.
And, even the amount of exploitation of Haiti, even by the Clintons and people like this, is just, it's just unbelievable that this could continue going on. But
right. And sometimes people go over, and sometimes they have the best of intentions, but what seems to happen is that the peoples of Haiti end up being misused. And right now there are huge gang violence and riots in Haiti for supremacy, because the state is a failed state. It's falling apart. And every time it was getting its act together, the U.S. Secret Service would go in and cripple it.
The Secret Service?
The foreign, our government in various forms would go in and sabotage the new government, and they would fall. And then all of a sudden we have chaos again.
Yeah.
It's happened multiple times.
Well, it's been the whole paradigm.
It was happening before Papa Doc.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Monroe Doctrine, like halfway through the 19th century. It's like we've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, and for economic and political reasons. And I even think just to a certain extent, there are even, I'll say it this way. In intense Voudon rites, you do release very difficult to control energies. And I think that there's a fear of that happening in Haiti and among Black peoples in general.
Yeah.
And on the plantations here in the Americas, in the North America, oftentimes indigenous spiritual practices were forbidden by the master of the plantation. The use of the drum oftentimes is outlawed because it not only invoked intense spiritual energies, but it was also a way that slaves used to communicate with each other over distances. It was the drum.
Okay.
Yes, and so the drum was often
good tech.
Illegal because it was seen as a way to get around things. So it has a long history. But it's the other side of that is that there is a enormously powerful psychotechnology there. If you go to some fundamentalist Pentecostal African American churches, you will notice something that very often the preacher will be preaching his thing with the congregation, and there'll be a call and response. And very oftentimes people will get very excited about it, and they will feel, quote, possessed by the Spirit, by Jesus in this case. And the ushers would, dutifully come and get them and take them out. Okay, so that's one way of being sort of like awakening that energy. Another is that if you watch very closely some African American dances early on, from the jitterbug all the way to up today, there is a movement and a lot of movement emphasizing the lower back and spine, stimulating that. Yes,
interesting.
Flexing that lower back and spine.
Interesting.
Sacral region is another way to stimulate that energy and wake it up. Yeah, it doesn't stay there because the folks don't have the techniques of being able to sustain it up there, which you would be able to do in Kundalini or Kriya Yoga. So it doesn't just, so it rises, but then it just goes back down too. And the whole point of Kriya Yoga and Kundalini Yoga, as you know, is to not only raise it gradually, but also to keep it, stabilize it there. You raise it higher and stabilize it there. Raise it higher and stabilize it there. So, but the powerful psychotechnology is there.
It sounds like you might have personal experience as well. Is that the case with Voudon and that type of thing? Tell me about that. I mean, podcasts are the medium of stories, so I would love to hear about this.
Well, I haven't. I've only participated in one Voudon rite, and I didn't particularly like it.
Okay.
It was a little too much energy, so to speak, coming in at one time. And at the time I was in Ilia Ife in Africa, and I had to do some things to initiate. You have to do certain kinds of rituals to initiate yourself into the circle of a particular community or person. And one of the things I had to do was to go to what's called the fetish market in town. There's this market, huge outdoor market, and pick up some bizarre items, I thought, and bring them back to this Babaloa, this priest. And so I did it. It's pretty weird, but I did it. And then we did some other things later on. And then later on that night, when I went back to my place to stay and sleep, I'm laying there sleeping. And, I should say this. When I was in the fetish market, I hooked eyes onto one woman there who was selling some wares of one kind or another. And I wasn't interested in buying them. I didn't need them. But we talked for a little bit. Later that night when I went to sleep, I'm in the middle of a dream and I'm sleeping. And all of a sudden, it's like somebody reached in and pulled the screen away from my dream. And there she was in a very frightening sort of way. And I woke up and I was really, really scared. I didn't like that. I'm being honest.
Yeah. Was that as far as it went, or?
That's as far as it went. I said, no, I'm not going down that path anymore.
Yeah. I had a somewhat similar experience, not in Africa, but, I was very deeply interested in Voudon in my late teens and early 20s, and, got initiated into things like this. And the terror is real, and it definitely felt, it was not for me, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for it. It scares me. I mean, it's like, there's also the level of how involved in human trafficking it is in West Africa.
I wasn't aware of that at that time. I was only aware primarily of this particular technique and experience.
It's real for sure, though. It's real.
Oh, it's quite real.
Very real.
I said, no. I like a predictable path, and that is why I stayed with Kundalini yoga.
Yeah,
because it is slower. But it's more, you conduct the life current in a much more soothing and predictable way, and it's pleasurable. It's not terrifying. In my experience as the living servant, it's always been very pleasurable.
It also adds, it doesn't detract from your life. It allows you to do your normal life stuff.
No, not at all. No,
it makes it better. Yeah.
It enhances it tremendously.
I got the sense with Voudon that, it's there's no half measures with it. It's like you're either in or you're out. And when you're in, it's like joining the mafia. And I feel like it's also not the kind of thing that you should just randomly walk up to. It tends to be the type of thing that people get born into or called to, right?
You have to be trained the right way. And I decided, nope, my intuition was that I wanted something that was more publicly demonstratable, replicatable. I could explore with other people. Do cause and effect experiments, test things out.
Do you feel that the gods and spirits are real?
Absolutely.
And do you feel that the gods and spirits in the North American Voudon traditions are the same ones from Africa, or are they new ones?
I believe that they are the same, but they're watered down.
Interesting. How do you mean?
They're not as powerful because, unfortunately, many teachers in the African American traditions of Voudon are not as disciplined as in either West Africa or, for that matter, in Bahia, in Brazil, where many of the traditions still linger in their original form. And there are some very good, very, very good teachers here in the U.S., but most that I've talked to have not been, put it this way. They like the ceremonies and they like the dress and the garb and so forth. But in terms of the actual tradition disciplines, physical disciplines, the breathing disciplines, the focus of attention disciplines are not as deep or as intense as I would like. That's me speaking. I own that.
Do you know, I've been spending a lot more time in New Orleans and kind of looking around for stuff. And the sense I get from New Orleans is a lot of that stuff is not there, or it's kind of a tourist version. But there is Sally Ann Glassman who's there. Have you come across her stuff?
I remember the name from somewhere.
She's written a bunch of books. She's kind of the big Voudon priestess there, but she's white and Jewish. And so she kind of approaches it from a Kabbalistic angle. But her stuff is great.
It's the same. It's the same energy.
Yeah, and she did some syncretizing it with Western magic, which is really interesting. So
it's the same energy that Kabbalah talks about the energies awakening in different areas and moves along the spine. Kundalini the same, Kriya the same. It's the same force. It's the same energy. We call it by different names, and we have different methodologies and techniques.
How so, and what names?
One, so, Kriya Yoga, from what I understand of the Yoganandas, is not exactly the same as the Kundalini Yoga of the classical traditions. But there's a 90% overlap. There's a 90% overlap. And also there are some things that you should not do unless you are actually being watched very closely by a teacher, by a master. You cannot open a book, start doing
Yeah. No, you can't.
You do that, and it's like, you know what? I think I'll be an electrician. Let me go get some wires and stick them in here. And
yes, that's a great metaphor. Yeah, that's a very good metaphor.
See what happens. No, you don't do that. It's as much of a science that requires an apprenticeship and learning and preparation as anything else.
It takes a long time too, and
it takes a long time, and it takes commitment.
I think a lot of my experience also, and to myself too. I mean, to a large extent, it's like I feel a lot of certainly Americans are not cool with authority and the idea of ceding, because with the guru system, it's like you do what the guru says. Period. Whether you like it or not, you have to cede authority to the guru.
Yes,
otherwise, and I think that otherwise it's just your ego directing the show, and then you're going to get nowhere. Right. So
not very far, and if the guru has their act together, and usually they do, the serious one, they will at some point will have you do exercises to prove things to yourself, not take it simply on their authority. I mean, Yogananda's teacher. Yogananda was in the ashram for what was it, 12 years?
Long time, since he was a kid too.
And Sri Yukteswar trained him in many of the other kinds of things. And Yukteswar apparently was not a very wordy guy, but he demonstrated things that the Yogananda would then do for himself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Fearsome teacher.
Yes, he was a teacher.
Yeah.
And, and he didn't get people gathered around him because he gave orders. He was the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
He was the real thing.
I completely agree.
Yeah. And a very, very, very powerful teacher. For those of you who are interested, his soul book, The Holy Science.
Oh, absolutely.
Is an absolute distilled masterpiece.
Absolutely. I think the most important part of that book is he went back and redid the math and said, we're not in the Kali Yuga, we're in Dwapara Yuga, we're coming out of it. I mean, that piece of information alone, people love to embrace this Kali Yuga idea as like a call to extremism or to doing whatever. And we're not in the Kali Yuga, we're not in the Iron Age. That was the Middle Ages. That was the bubonic plague, at least according to Yukteswar. So that's a great book, The Holy Science.
Yes, it is.
Well, man, there's so many topics we can cover and go into. What about you've touched on the identity war and the culture war in the U.S., not to take it back to a more grim subject, but what do you feel is driving that deep down and, outside of the stuff the stuff we've already talked about, but do you have any other thoughts on resolving that, hopefully?
Well, frightening. I don't know about totally resolving it, but I do know that when people are frightened and anxious, they're more easily controlled. If people are reflective and they think about things and they look at the fundamentals of their situation, they tend to be more rational, deliberative, and so forth. But if people are being told something's going to be taken from you, you're going to be put in a bad situation. You are in some way threatened, either financially threatened, economically threatened, genetically threatened, whatever, then you become anxious and you're easier to control. A frightened person is easier to control than a person who's rational. And so if you can keep your population fearful, then you control them. That was the whole basis of Nazi Germany, fear. That was the whole basis of Mao in China. Keep everybody fear. But that was the whole point of Soviet Russia. Keep everybody afraid by propaganda and other things. They didn't have enough police to lock everybody up. And the terror is that when people stop being afraid, then your thing falls apart. As long as you can keep them fearful, they're gonna come in and do this awful thing to you. They're gonna da 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 da, and people go, oh God, and then somebody comes along and promises you they'll be a strong man, and I'll make everything better. People say, save us, strong man. It's an old formula. It works. It works. Franco in Spain, it worked. Hitler in Germany, it worked. Stalin in the Soviet Union, it works. It works.
And you think that's driving a lot of some of the conflicts that are going on right now?
I think a lot of them in the Middle East, yeah. Hamas is telling its people with some background history too. It's not just out of the nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
The Israeli leaders, Netanyahu was telling his people, and they're going, okay. So you get two groups of terrified people doing terrible things to each other with no solution in sight. And they're both suffering. It's like Thomas Jefferson said about slavery a little bit. He said, at least on some level, philosophically, spiritually, he didn't approve of slavery, but he said it's like he's got the wolf by the ears. He can't. If he lets it go.
What did he mean specifically by that?
I mean, he needed the wolf. He needed the wolf of slavery. But if he let the ears of the wolf go, God knows what the wolf would do to him. The paradox, right? Well, how many politicians are we finding today, no names, are telling you that if you don't watch, right and left, by the way, if you don't watch out, da 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 da, and you get you hyped up. One of the biggest selling jobs in the country is selling Donald Trump, right?
Yep.
For the good or the bad.
Yeah, and everyone is obsessed with him. It's like they can't stop. Even now, he's not even president anymore. People are still obsessed with him.
And he understands perfectly how the system works.
Mm-hmm.
He's an entertainer. So yeah. And if the media hadn't paid attention to him way back in 2000 and whatever it was, we wouldn't be hearing about him at all. But they paid attention to him. He knows how to do that. Well, there are lots of others also, and they're telling people scary things, and people are believing it. And what used to be a fringe belief is now mainstreamed. Many things and scary stuff. It's an outright lie.
Yes,
an outright lie. But
which one are you talking about? There's a lot of these outright lies going on right now.
White replacement theory.
Yes, yeah.
It's a lie.
And now it's become mainstream in the Republican Party, which is frightening.
It's become mainstream, and it's a lie.
Right.
And it terrifies traditionally conservative Republicans. It terrifies people who are not of that background, and everybody's like freaked out. But there's some people who are retaining political power by stoking that.
Yes. One of the most disturbing things to me, certainly about the last 2 months, has been the extent to which both the far left and the far right have become utterly terrifying. And now they're kind of agreeing. It's like, hey, maybe anti-Semitism's okay. Maybe that's a good idea. It's just like, how did we end up here? It's like,
it's a bizarre thing. In a supposedly a free society, we've gotten to the
horrible.
point.
It's horrible.
It's horrible.
It's horrible.
It's horrible. And people forget where anti-Semitism led in the middle of the last century.
That's really scary because it's now out of living memory for people now. And I think young people they don't care. They don't care.
Yeah, they don't care. They don't realize that 6 million plus, and these were the Jews, were exterminated.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about asked to leave the country. I'm talking about incinerated. Based on this kind of
and
thing.
not even just in Germany, all over Europe and Eastern Europe.
All over Europe.
They weren't involved in Germany or the Nazis or anything like that. They got conquered.
They were in Romania and Eastern Europe. Just came in and wiped them out. And people get swept up in that, and they're willing to do that kind of thing in situations like that, whereas otherwise they'd never do that. There are people, this isn't pleasant, but there are large swaths of the population in the United States that, if put in certain kinds of situations, would do things.
Yes. Yes.
They would, in the name of saving whatever. And there are.
And there are
And
people who are doing that. I mean, in terms of some of these shootings and
yep, there are.
Yeah.
Those are the individual expressions of it, but it's a pattern, obviously, and it can get uniformized. It can get made into a uniform way, and it's a very scary, very, very scary thing. I don't think it will come to pass. I think we might have, unfortunately, spasms of large group violence.
Yeah.
But I don't think the overwhelming majority of Americans want to see that.
No.
We
got Netflix. We got too many streaming services and food and couches.
No,
yeah, this is too much work. We're not physically fit enough for that.
Yeah, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that.
Well, I certainly hope not. Knock on wood. So maybe we should. We're coming to the end, so maybe let's talk about more positive solutions. So how can, since as you point out, we are all of African descent, how can we embrace our African unconscious?
I think for me, it is to see how that dovetails with your own individual ethnicity and consciousness, and see it as a way to deepen your own soul. And I do mean the word soul, how to deepen it, because that is where most of our ancestors are. That's where most of our ancestors are. And in our society, particularly here in the United States, we don't think very much about ancestral consciousness. We seem to have left that aside a couple of 100 years ago, but it is real. I mean, it is real. And, we are not only physical beings, but we're also psychic beings. And the residue of that is in our collective minds and the psyches, and it influences us. We have no trouble recognizing that subtle things that happened in, say, our own individual childhood that we're barely aware of influence our behavior. We accept that. And we accept that certain family dynamics are with us, for better or for worse, that follow us through many different phases of our lives in terms of our behaviors, our relationships, so on and so forth. So we kind of accept that. But what we have not accepted is that we have an ancestral history that also influences our consciousness, and that is real, it is biogenetic, and it is behavioral in many ways, And if you looked closely at many families, you would see certain patterns of behavior that go back generations. And sometimes they are revered, but sometimes there are also things that we're embarrassed or ashamed of. But they're part of our history, and they have a causal influence on our behavior, our decisions, and so forth. We have family histories in which we have heroes, but if we look close enough and ask sometimes around Thanksgivings or others from old timers, we also find that some members of our family were villains.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, did terrible things, So, but that ancestral consciousness, and I would posit that ancestral consciousness goes back much further than we can remember. I'm not talking about my grandfather and my great-grandfather. I'm talking about their own great-great-grandparents and how that influenced their behavior. And we were talking a little while ago about the Holocaust. Well, in living memory, some people who survived or perished in the European Holocaust, their generations after them had traumatic histories.
Yes.
Influenced by that. It is
the
same.
Epigenetics.
Slaves.
Yeah.
It was the same with slaves.
Yeah. People need to realize that it's like trauma doesn't end in one generation.
No,
it gets passed down. Yeah.
Yes. And it can be a physical phenomenon also. And there are certain we don't have enough time to get into it, but there are certain dream motifs that reappear in family dreams and histories that are like
Interesting.
They're like leitmotifs. They're like repetitive themes and stories that reappear. So our consciousness is certainly composed of our own individual ego and generated experience, which is totally cool, totally valid. But we also have wavelengths, so to speak, in us that are from other prior times that influence our consciousness and influence our behavior. And so one of the things that we can do is not only explore that, but also I would recommend that everyone find an intuitive meditative discipline, prayer, contemplation that they like, that appeals to them intuitively, and just stay with it. Because it'll all lead the same way, same place. Every tributary leads into the same river. Okay, so just stay with it and be honest about it and surrender yourself into it and stay with it for years. It is like someone coming up to you decades and decades ago and saying, "Hey, man, did you hear about this company? They called Microsoft. Yeah, that's it. And I'm telling you, man, if you put, a couple of your paychecks in that, I'm telling you, it'll pay off down the road." Well, it is.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It pays off in the moment also.
In the moment also.
Yeah.
But if you stay with that for decades, then you will be a different person, much deeper further down the road, and much less fear of many things, including the fear of death.
I agree. Yeah. And
you recognize the continuity of your own consciousness.
Consequently, you can still fall off and stop, as I've done. I'm getting back to it now. And then it's like, but then you realize how important it is. Like there's that classic phrase, no meditation, no peace. With meditation, no peace, KNOW, peace. I agree. I kind of got more of a sense this year. Like I really feel that the two biggest things missing in the European religions are connection to ancestors and connection to place.
Yes.
And it doesn't have either of those. And those are like, you can't just like leave, those are major food groups. You can't just leave those out, I don't think.
No, you can't. Well, part of our selling point in crossing the seas and coming to, for Europeans anyway, crossing the seas and coming to the United States was leave the old country. Come here and become an American. You change your name from some Italian, etc., some East European, whatever, some other difficult to pronounce name. You shorten it and you Americanize it. You become American. That's your identity now. And so we had to, many people thought, they had to jettison huge parts of who they were in order to become American. Some of that was true, but mostly it was an issue of integration, being able to integrate your sense of self. Many, one of the great, for better or for worse, creations of the establishment in the United States was many people came from Germany, and they came from Ireland, and they came from France, and they came from Poland. And when they got over here, they were initially Polish Americans, or they were French Americans, and they were German Americans. Eventually, over the generations, they just simply became white Americans in comparison to Black Americans. And having Black Americans helped Europeans move beyond their tribalism and become white. That was the tax. That was the agreement. So, and it worked. Now, it intensified racism, but the trade-off was that it consolidated all the different non-African and non-indigenous tribes into one sort of block. I mean, there's still ethnic enclaves in New York, Chicago, blah, 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 blah. But you did not have difficulty moving into another white neighborhood because you happen to be Irish. You were. And your spouse could be Irish and you were Italian. But you were an American couple. That is how America dealt with that issue. And they dealt with it relatively good. Didn't have to be that way. But that was what the model turned out to be.
Do you feel that
that's not working anymore?
No.
It's not working anymore.
Do you feel that something similar happened with Black people as well? I mean, you don't hear people saying well, I'm Yoruban, or I'm from Benin,
actually,
or I'm from.
Actually, it was the other. And in the situation with Africans and African American, you oftentimes were forbidden to even know what part of Africa you came from. You were all thrown together, forbidden to use your language, and so you had to use English, or some variation of patois English. And so it was a matter of, for Africans in America, rediscovering what their African lineage was, as opposed to pushing it away. And then you had your class developments here in the United States, where many upper class, quote unquote, upper class African Americans denied or eschewed for long periods of time their African roots because it was not cool. That was not a sign of being acculturated. So all those dynamics are there, But we're the country that's done one of the best jobs, actually, despite of all our stuff. We're one of the countries that's done the best in terms of getting all these different ethnic groups together under the banner of being, quote, Americans, unquote. And now we're having this battle, not so much with African Americans, but with Latin Americans coming to the States. And so now one of the big push among conservative Republicans, supposedly, is to keep our southern borders clean and clear from the horde to sweep across. It used to be in the 1800s, the yellow horde, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese coming, right? Railroad.
How dare they build railroads and run laundries and try to have nice lives.
Right. And now it's the same story. It's just different characters, but it's the same story.
Yeah, this country would collapse if
it would collapse.
If it's just like get real,
Who's going to do your gardening? Who's going to pick your food? Who's going to
It's not like conservative Republicans are rushing to do those jobs.
No, it's not. When they've had an opportunity to do it multiple times, they haven't done it.
Well,
and they're not going to do it either.
No.
But it makes good political fodder, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It keeps people angry.
They're saying, "Yeah, we're not going to let blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm going to bring an army there. And we're going to do it. Yeah. Except when we need you to work, then you got to work on it."
Well, if somebody wants to rediscover or discover some of the African traditions, whether it's Kemetic or Yoruban or anything, what do you recommend?
Well, I would recommend, first of all, obviously, Our African Unconscious, because I tried to weave as much of that together as I could, biologically, medically, clinically, and otherwise, historically. But there are lots of other excellent historical sources I cite. I was at some pains, and I may have overdone it in terms of trying to document as much as I could, so people could say, where is he coming from about that? And you can see, well, no, this is where this comes from, and it has a basis. But there are many really powerful historical studies and documentation of all of this data that we've been talking about. It's not like something I've created in my mind.
Right.
I've integrated it, a compendium, and tried to use what backgrounds that I've had in the clinical area to highlight that in terms of clinical science, medicine, and so forth. And I was originally a history major in college, so I had an interest in history and archaeology. And so those, but then you'd find other people with a different kind of bent than me that would present much of the same evidence in a different kind of way. And one of the examples would be book Black Athena by historian at Cornell. Was it Cornell? Yeah, I think it was Cornell. But it was called Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Modern Civilization, Western Civilization. Classic book. He was a white guy, but his main thing was history and the truth. And so he did. And there were many who wrote in the 18th century who said the same sort of thing. They were drowned out by other voices. But Count Voudon, his book, The Ruins of Civilization, he talked about the African and Egyptian roots of Western civilization and its science. So this has been known for a long period of time. It just has not been dominant. And now we're going through a slightly regressive period where there are a lot of folks who are frightened that they're losing their country, all this kind of stuff. And so they're enacting a lot of these laws that, you can't teach certain kinds of things in school, et cetera, et cetera. You've seen the movie. You've seen the movie before.
Yep.
This is just the most recent iteration of it.
Well, despite despite that, this has been a phenomenal interview. The 2 hours have flown by. I've really, really enjoyed this.
Yeah, they have, haven't they?
They have. How can people find out more about you and get your books?
The books are all right there on Amazon. Just Our African Unconscious. And the other one we didn't talk about, Dark Light Consciousness. We didn't talk about that directly.
Well, maybe we can talk. I'd love to have you back on, so maybe we can talk about that next time.
Okay. But write on the web or Amazon Books. You just write Amazon Books, Edward Bruce Bynum, all kinds of stuff will come up, And I have a website, Obelisk Foundation, like the word obelisk, and then the word foundation. And that has in it a number of more technical clinical articles about, depression and other clinical items that we didn't talk about that as much today. But the main thing would be to go just, Amazon Books, type in my name and then make up your own mind.
Okay. Well, Dr. Bynum, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
I've enjoyed it myself thoroughly. And thank you for inviting me again.
Of course.
And, yes.
I look forward to it. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Hope you really, really enjoyed that. I definitely had a lot of fun in that conversation. Meet us at magick.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can learn all the skills you need to unleash your true self. I will see you in class, and until next time, hang in there.